Hello everyone, welcome to On the Mind. Depending on what order you watch our episodes in, this could be episode 2 or episode 4 for you. But we are very happy to be joining you today. My name is Anish. I'm one of the presidents of Imperial Neurotech this year.
And I'm Ayesha. I'm president at KCL Neurotech this year.
And this year we're very lucky to be joined by the team from ARIA. So we have Jacques in the center here. We have Tom on the left here and Gillian on the right, depending on, hopefully the camera is not flipped orientation. Welcome guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us. It's so exciting to be here.
Oh, we're very excited to have you. For those who don't know, we are recording this right before a talk that you guys are going to do later. So we might have to cut it a bit short, but hopefully we've heard, enough neurotech into the half an hour we have. Okay, so question number 1 is sort of just for someone who just randomly clicked onto this podcast, someone who's no idea what's going on. And it does happen. I was talking to someone today who just found us on Instagram ads. Would you be able to do literally a 2-sentence hard sell of Neurotech? Someone's never heard of it, curious about what it is potentially. Could you just talk, as if it's a complete stranger? Why should they care?
Sure. So ultimately, Neurotech is trying to find new ways to interface with the brain. So why should we care about that? Well, many neurological and neuropsychiatric conditions are really disorders of brain circuits and disorders of the brain. So we're trying to come up with new ways to interface with the brain to be able to address those. Yeah.
Amazing. And Gillian, did you have a hard sell?
I think, my hard sell would be Neurotech. For me, is all about technologies that allow us to both read and then stimulate the brain to be able to change its activity. So I think that's my hard sell. Yeah,
I mean, I agree. There's so much potential in terms of like the disorders that currently exist. I know a lot of companies are actually also doing sort of almost an extension of human experience. I mean, obviously that's almost Neuralink's like motto is, we try to change the way that humans experience the world. And quite a few companies, I mean, even small entrepreneurs that I've spoken to recently are talking about changing human experience. Would you say that's a goal of ARIA at all, or is it mainly disorder focused?
I think for me, the first applications are really going to be in the clinic. I'm still kind of skeptical whether like healthy people in their 30s are going to be getting implants. Maybe it's going to happen. I'm not sure, but certainly for the next decade, I think it's unlikely to happen. So as a result, at ARIA, we're really looking where we can get kind of huge leverage points that are happening right now, and right now that's in the clinics. I think the first applications are going to be for different types of brain disorders. Yeah,
I agree 100%. Okay, all right, let's get straight into a bit of your background. Obviously, You've done a little bit of research. So let's talk a little bit about, I guess, your time in academia. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about how studying physics and philosophy leads towards questions of the brain, or how you specifically decided to pivot towards those?
Yeah, so my background's, as you said, is in physics. So I did my PhD, I did a postdoc doing things very, very different from the brain. I was trying to build quantum computers. And I loved working on those problems, and I loved the people, and it was awesome. And I learned a ton. But it kind of became increasingly clear I wanted to work on technologies that were actually going to help people in the near term. Quantum computers are a really long way away. So at its core, I've always been interested in notions of computation. How do physical systems compute? What are the physical limits of a conventional silicon computer? What are the fundamental limits of a quantum computer? And it also begs the question is, what are the limits of computation in the brain? How does the brain compute? So during my postdoc, I actually did a few courses on neuroscience, and I was just fascinated. And just to be clear, I don't have an A-level in biology. So
me neither, I should say. Very unqualified people on the podcast today, guys.
But actually, I think that points towards the kind of vast spectrum of folks that are trying to, work in neurotech, and actually you do need to solve these problems. So I had this kind of idea that I was like, I don't think I want to be a physics professor. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to be a physics professor. And I was like, these aren't the problems I want to work on for the rest of my career. So this was just at the time the pandemic hit. And I said, I'm going to try and figure out if it's a ridiculous idea to become a neuroscientist. So I spoke with a ton of people. I spoke with neuroscientists, and they were like, this is an awesome idea. And I spoke with physicists, and they were like, this is a terrible idea. It's going to kill your career. And I ended up listening to the neuroscientists, and I ended up doing another postdoc in neuroscience and learned so much. I can talk about this at length, but my big takeaway is that biology is noisy. The brain is noisy and sweaty, and things happen for reasons that are just biology. And actually, that was like a really important lesson. In physics, if I built something and it didn't work, that's because I built it wrong. In biology, that's not the case.
Would you say that was an appeal for you? Did you like the idea that potentially you could be proved wrong despite having done everything right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I think a big part about doing experiments as an experimentalist is you need to know what your error bars are, right? You're going to try and build something or do an experiment, and you need to know when you can't optimize things anymore within some set of error bars that's your readout. And that was a big learning for me, was moving into neuroscience and was like, man, these error bars are real big. It took a lot of adjustment, but yeah, it was great. I learned so much, and I'm so glad I made that jump.
Yeah, I mean, it's called the world's biggest mystery, isn't it? So, I mean, you're going to get a lot of errors.
Well, talking more specifically about your quantitative background, I just wanted to know, what do you think that background for you brings to neurotechnology and its applications?
That's a great question. I think there's two ways to answer that. I think from doing experimental physics, you just have a particular way of addressing questions. Typically, you have an incredibly complex thing that's sitting on an optics bench, and your goal is to try and figure out why it doesn't work, because invariably it will not work. So you want to try and cut the problem in half. You want to do an experiment that says this thing or this thing, and you want to keep iterating until you find that out. It's the same when you look at the brain. Okay, so I'm looking at some circuit and how it's processing. What are the possible confounds? If I'm doing experiments with mice, maybe they're just listening to the click rather than actually responding to my stimuli. Okay, so that kind of scientific method, I would say, is amplified even more in the brain sciences, but particularly in neurotech. I think neurotech, and I'm sure you would agree, is probably one of the most interdisciplinary fields that you can get. You need to bring together folks from engineering, you need to bring together folks from biology, clinicians, the whole spectrum of people, and try and speak some kind of common language and try and build technologies that are really, really hard. So being able to bring that kind of engineering perspective to know what the kind of capabilities of devices are, and also really trying to understand, what are the fundamental physical limits of what we can read out of the brain, of data rates, of signal to noise ratio. All these principles are critical in designing neurotechnologies.
I agree 100%. Talking about the multidisciplinary aspect of it then, I for some reason get so many people still coming up to me saying, oh, I have X background. I've got biomedical engineering, for example. Can I do neurotech? And my answer is almost exclusively yes. Like, I mean, in my first presentation, the Neurotech 101, we talk about all the imperial degrees that could lead to neurotech, and it's almost every single one. Like there's no discipline that leads you away from it. So I mean, Gillian, do you think? I mean, I presume because you're nodding, you're going to agree. But do you think that's something you would say as well, in that you would encourage anyone like your philosophy background even to try and get involved?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I've actually talked to some philosophers that are addressing the ethical issues that we're facing in neurotechnology, and that kind of points back to your initial question about what about augmentation versus like clinical therapeutic applications. That would be a perfect thing for a philosopher to really think about. Or, I'm sure there's a million other very good questions that philosophers could help address that I can't come up with.
We are going to get into there's a lot of philosophy of mine in these interview questions.
Okay, and Gillian, do you think a more biological background is generally favoured? We meet people from all backgrounds and try to reassure them of the multidisciplinary sort of nature of neurotech, but how far do you agree? Because I, as a life science student, I feel like everybody I meet at KCL is the opposite to Imperial. They're like, I want to get into neurotech, but I have a life science degree. Like, how does that work? So I can imagine it brings some unique skills to the table, but what do you think about that?
I still do think maybe that's not what's as mediatized today in the big neurotech companies, in the sense that a lot of advances currently have been made around electrodes and novel materials, and then the computing that goes along to decipher that. However, I really do think life science is a key, and you could actually see that as an opportunity, because it means that a lot of people haven't necessarily thought how to apply life science tools to neurotech, and we actually at ARIA believe there's huge untapped potential there. So I would definitely heavily encourage life science students to think about this.
So pleased to hear that.
and if you look at some of the advances that are happening in like gene engineering or like stem cell engineering or CRISPR, right? Exactly. That is the frontier of technology right now, not even just neuroscience, but broadly. And I think there's a huge piece to be done about how do we apply that to the brain. Yeah.
No, I mean, like when I'm looking through and finding papers that we could read as a society, it's almost every single Nature journal has something. You know, Nature Machine Intelligence has something that's interesting. Nature Neuroscience obviously is very applicable, but a million other Nature journals, Nature Physics, Nature. I mean, I could go on forever and ever and ever. Like there is research on the frontiers of every single discipline that does apply to neurotech to some degree. So I think that's very cool. Okay, so back to a bit more about your background then. So you won the Discovery Fellowship back in 2022. Could you tell us maybe what that prize was? Was that the postdoc thing you were referencing earlier?
Yes.
Could you tell us about what the prize was for and maybe what you did with the money potentially?
Yeah, great. So this was as I moved across into neuroscience, as is the case with science, you need money to do it. And I was looking for fellowships that could basically pay for me to do the work I wanted to do. So I was in a kind of systems neuroscience lab that developed kind of cutting edge tools, optical tools, electrophysiological tools, but really applied it to hard systems neuroscience problems. So I was really the only physicist in that lab. So I needed to try and find somewhere that would fund me. And the problem was I had no track record in biology. Moreover, I didn't have an A-level in biology. So I applied to the BBSRC Discovery Fellowship, and they were particularly interested in folks that were moving across into different fields. So what I proposed was a project looking at something called voltage imaging. So maybe many of your listeners are familiar with things like calcium imaging. So the idea is you express fluorescent proteins such that when the calcium concentration changes in a cell, you can read that out optically. The kind of cutting edge now is actually voltage indicators. So when the voltage of that membrane changes, you can read that fluctuation out. Now, action potentials happen on the scale of milliseconds. So that means you need very high speed imaging. So my project was about how we can combine optogenetics to turn neurons on, presynaptic neurons, and then use voltage imaging to read postsynaptic neurons out and actually look to see if we can measure synaptic strengths optically.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, maybe we can actually look at things like plasticity changes. If something happens in mouse models, if something happens to the mouse, can we see that those connections change in some desired way? And you can. It's noisy as heck, but you can. And what was kind of neat when I started doing this was I went in the lab and it was the same Ti sapphire laser that I had been using my entire career in physics.
Yeah.
So I was kind of used to the lasers. I knew how to do optics. It's just pointing at a different thing.
Yeah.
I then had to learn how to do mouse surgeries, and that was definitely a learning curve.
Doable though? I mean, I'm a computational background, but obviously would like to do something more biological and neuroscience-y. Is it something is best learned in the lab, you'd say, or courses?
Totally doable. Especially, a lot of it's just hands-on practice. It's going to be really, really terrifying if you've never done a dissection before. For the first time, I'd say the first month, it was terrifying.
The smell of formaldehyde. It's just you leave the lab and you are hungry, but you stink.
Oh my God, exactly, yeah. Just spending so long just over a kind of microscope. Just
deep breaths. Try not to pass out.
Don't drink coffee beforehand. All this stuff.
Yeah, all that stuff. Okay. Yeah, okay, of course. So can you tell us how you got involved in ARIA and what exciting developments have taken place over the last couple of years?
Has it been a couple of years now? Is it just over a year? I'm not sure how long.
So technically, I think the ARIA bill was passed in 2023.
Yes, not even
And then, you can correct me here. And then, officially, we started ramping things up beginning of this year.
Okay. So what have you guys been up to? Or we'll start with how you personally got involved, and then what have you guys been up to?
And I'll bounce over to these folks. Okay, so how did I get involved? So I had actually I did a postdoc in the US. So I was kind of aware of DARPA, and I'd met DARPA program managers. And for your listeners that aren't familiar, DARPA is a funding agency in the US. And their goal, I think, verbatim, is to prevent kind of military surprise or something like this. And really the goal was to fund high-risk, high-reward research. And DARPA has led to the creation of the internet, mRNA vaccines, GPS, a whole variety of different things.
Just to jump in my own question about DARPA, someone told me very recently that it was individual-centric. I think is it the program director thing that makes it individuals?
Exactly, yeah. So the model here is that in the US, program managers in ARIA, program directors, have huge amounts of autonomy to really kind of define what they think is an area that, if true, would change the world. Okay, so
it's a lofty goal.
It's a lofty goal. It's a lofty goal, and you just got to have a lot of shots on target, because you need to know that many of these things are just not going to be successful. So I kind of spoken with DARPA program managers before, and they have this kind of like lore about them, and they were all like awesome. I was like, man, this sounds like an incredible job. Imagine if you can just define a whole research field and drive, and drive funding towards it. That'd be awesome. And then I moved to the UK, and then I heard these kind of rumblings that ARIA was going to be set up, and then this job ad came out, like no job ad I'd ever seen before. The job ad, I forget exactly. I looked it up on the Wayback Machine the other day, and it was something like, do you want to create the future or something like this? And I was just like, I've never seen anything like this. Like, man, I'm going to absolutely apply for this. And then went through what I would say is probably like a 4-month personality test, which involved, technical interviews, which involved a finalist day with about 20 other people applying for the same job. And then, got the job.
Congratulations. Here we are.
How about you guys? How did you end up here?
Tom, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. Mine's a bit of an unusual one. Basically, I left university kind of trying to decide between doing either a PhD in robotics at the time or going into this job offer I had for management consulting. And it was like a kind of bit of a head and heart, and decided to go for the consulting offer ultimately, because I was kind of worried about what felt like the kind of risk of solo working for a long time. And so I did that for 3 years and learned quite a lot, but started really missing science and technology. And it felt like all of the kind of really fun and interesting things I was learning at uni weren't really on the job anymore. And around that time, someone who I'd worked with through an internship in my undergrad reached out and said, hey, I've heard about this thing that's growing at ARIA, and I think you'd be a great fit. Basically, you kind of do a lot of the you've got the consulting background, so lots of program management, but also clearly kind of miss science and tech from when I spoke to you. And so I took a look at it and was like, wow, this seems pretty cool what they're trying to do. And in a kind of similar thing, applied, and not quite as demanding and rigorous, but got the job, and here we are.
and maybe for context here as well. So Tom is the program specialist, as word we use at ARIA, which is essentially the kind of project manager, make sure everything stays on time. And Gillian is the technical specialist, essentially the kind of technical expertise that supports the program.
Yeah, so I think that's a great segue into my background and how I ended up at ARIA, which is I was actually working for a brain-computer interface company called BlackRock Neurotech, which has kind of pioneered a lot of the BCI work. And I was working for them on developing novel, crazy, their next generation products, basically. And it was such a fun time. I mean, got to learn a lot about the space and think about the different technologies that can be used to interface with the brain. So absolutely loved my time there, but obviously working for a startup, you do have to have profits in mind, and commercialization in the near term has to be a priority, which was fantastic because I learned a lot about that. But when I saw this job at ARIA, where it's basically we're just funding really, really high risk things. And I just thought of all the ideas I'd had where it was I wish I could go off and build this. And I remember seeing that and I was like, wow, these people are going to be funding all of these crazy ideas. And in this role, I would get to work with those teams and learn about all these technologies and see how they're being applied and what works and what doesn't. So I completely fell in love with the job ad and applied and got really, really lucky after, I would have said rigorous interviews, but compared to Jack's, definitely much easier.
I feel like I was rigorous.
You were. I didn't have a finalist day with 20 other people, but you were very rigorous.
Thank you.
So both of yours, you already knew was going to be the Neurotech stream or program, I presume. But yours, was it just anything? You just, as in, the idea was to be a program director, and what you decide to do, you decide to do. Yeah,
in a kind of wild way, ARIA basically hired 8 program directors they just thought would be good at the job.
Okay.
And ARIA had its own kind of set of characteristics. Do you think you can kind of lead people behind a vision? Are you comfortable with uncertainty? Because there's a lot of uncertainty in this job. A bunch of other things. And So I kind of had this conviction that I was going to do something in the neurotech space. I'm in love with the field, but also it felt just so ripe in the UK for potential. We've got so much incredible talent across engineering, across biology, across neurosurgery, neurology. Like it's all here, and I just felt such an opportunity to really like ignite a flame under that. So that was kind of always on the back of my mind. But ARIA really gave us space and time to say, where do we see that white space? What is the thing that people aren't actually working on at the moment? We've got all these companies. What's the next thing that's not even on their radar? And going through that process of what we call discovery, chatting with hundreds of people, speaking, all across the UK, speaking with companies, speaking with academics, really that whole spectrum really allowed us to kind of shape what we call program is.
How do you prevent multiple program directors from picking the same sort of thing? Because I presume there are multiple that are interested in the brain. The brain is unanimously fascinating.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, actually, I would say, let me get this right, I would say probably 4 of the program directors have worked on brain-related things at some point. So some are professors currently who are working, who are doing a sabbatical in ARIA and run brain labs. We've got a vision neuroscientist. And actually for them, it was a real opportunity to say, maybe I'm going to launch a program in a different area. I'm going to bring some fresh perspectives. And I think that's the key thing, going back to our discussion around kind of interdisciplinary. Being able to bring a fresh perspective to really hard problems is absolutely critical. And that's something that ARIA allows us to do. So, what would happen if people wanted to run the kind of same program? We haven't got to that yet.
You're still hiring, aren't you?
We actually just closed the hiring.
Okay. Someone can apply to be CTO if you want to.
CTO. The CTO position is open.
Okay, so pivoting slightly, what are some of the most exciting papers that you've read about in the past couple of months? Very general question, but any paper at all.
So the paper that I recommend to anyone is who's interested in kind of moving into neurotech, particularly from a physical sciences background, but I think it's more broad than that, is Adam Marblestone's paper, Scalable Principles of Physical Recording, or Physical Principles of Scalable Recording.
You had one of the program directors, is David, I think it is? Or
Yes. David Ad is one of the authors on that paper.
Yeah, exactly. It's actually our first ever journal club read. So it's our first one on our website of the Scalable Principles. But please.
It's quite a bold one to read.
I know.
There's a very dense. There's a lot of things.
I know. I don't think many people are able to fully grasp it. I think we'll do it again at the end of the year.
So that is one that I recommend to everyone because it really just says what are the fundamental principles by which we can get signal in and out of the brain.
And sorry, you said that's from somebody with a background similar to yours.
Yeah, so the lead author is a kind of physicist, biologist, polymath, I think is fair to say.
Well, then I suppose I have an extended question of that then for maybe Gillian to answer as well. Are there any exciting papers that you think are really good for people starting out in neurotech coming from a life science background to sort of take a look at, or anything in general that you think is good for that transition?
Yeah. I think from a life science background, I can't remember a specific paper because I read several, but Jerzy Zablowski, who's a professor at Rice, actually has a life science background. Don't quote me on that. I don't know his background per se, but he works a lot using life science tools and applying them to neurotech.
Okay.
So I think that's a really good starting point.
Sorry, we might quite literally quote you on that over at KCL Neurotech. But yeah, okay. Thank you for that.
And I mean, we read papers like fascinating. Like I saw something about flexible electrodes come out literally yesterday. There's so many new things. I mean, we've literally got your paper about the invasive intercortical microelectrode ones, which are very cool. The same question again, but more papers, just because there's so much you could do.
I think it was another one. This is the awesome thing about neurotech is you can just have so many different angles on this. One of the ones that has been really inspiring to how I think about the potential and possibility of neurotech is some of this work from Helen Mayberg. Helen Mayberg is a professor at Mount Sinai, a neurologist, and is looking at how you can use DBS to treat treatment-resistant depression. And they had a Nature paper, I think from last year or the year before, where they actually showed, they have these DBS leads that can both stimulate and record. They showed that there are electrophysiological biomarkers that predict depressive relapses up to 5 weeks before it happens. And what that means is that potentially you can actually intervene. And if that's true, that's just a really remarkable thing, that there are features in our brain that can predict these types of conditions. And I saw some of their work, a poster from some of their work earlier this year, and they actually now think that there's plasticity effects going on. So it's not just, when this thing is stimulating, but you're actually seeing white matter regrowth, seeing strengthening of connections that might actually have long-lasting effect when it comes to depression.
Okay, we have so many questions about quantum computing as well. I mean, there's like a very rare chance to get so many different takes in one interview. We only have 6 minutes left. So I'll move over to philosophy and then we can move back to wherever we go. So we love talking about philosophy of mind. Like when we did our introduction to the brain talk, half of it's on the actual neuroscience of these are the parts of the brain and how it's structured and everything. The other half is me just talking about different views on philosophy of mind. When we had Andreas Schäfer down here, he described himself as a somewhat reductionist. I don't know if that was PR, and then we got into, and I think self-proclaimed more of a physical reductionist, more of like a physicalist, that everything is matter. I can see your eyes widening. We're going to ask you the exact same question, I'm afraid. But I mean, would you describe yourself in any particular camp, or are you agnostic to the view of the relationship between the mind and the body?
I don't, I think this is not a controversial take. I don't think we know what is causing consciousness. There are some really interesting studies about how do we actually measure features like consciousness in patients with locked-in syndrome or things like this. So that's to say, I think I fundamentally am a kind of, a physical reductionist, but I believe there are emergent properties that we just don't know yet. And that was one of the striking things going into neuroscience when I was like, okay, cool, how does computation work? And they were like, yeah, no. I know, right? Okay, what scale does it happen at? You're like, well, is it like synapses or is it brain regions? Well, it's kind of all of these things. So it's maybe a cop-out answer, but we have things that span nanometers to centimeters. We have things that span milliseconds to years. I believe there are just emergent phenomena that we have just not even begun to capture yet. And that's, I guess...
I think it's a very good answer. The same, I mean, if you have takes as to whether you think everything is physical, where you think there's a separate, I mean, not saying dualism in terms of a separate world out there, but as in there are just the nature of the mental world. It's very hard to really pin that down in a very short podcast interview answer. But yeah, do you have a view on it?
I mean, I do think that it's interesting that certain different experiences will elicit similar conclusions in people. So, for example, if you think about, there's a lot of psilocybin research going on at the moment. And when those patients are interviewed after they undergo those trials, they talk about this feeling of connectedness and oneness and the fact that their conscience is actually part of a larger conscience. And that's actually, I was talking to someone, a very interesting person 2 days ago at an event who's like ML AI person. And he also practices a lot of meditation. And he was saying that actually the whole practice of meditation is to try and get you into a similar state. And they view psychedelics as a cop-out, easier way to get there, but it prevents you from getting there on your own. And he claims that he can get to a similar state on his own through meditation. And I just think that it's so interesting that two different practices will elicit a very similar sort of user experience. And so that does make me think potentially there's something bigger, but once again, don't quote me on that. It's one of those things of you believe rather than you can prove scientifically. But
yeah, I mean, there's someone waiting outside to go into the studio, so we really can't be asking questions. But I was reading something this morning about absurdism, and if a mouse had the ability to know what they were, if they had, let's call quote unquote consciousness, how they would really grapple with the reality that they are stuck in the body of a mouse and only capable of doing things of a mouse, but their consciousness can ask questions of any kind of variety and from any point of view. And it's sort of like Pandora's box in that you can't put it back in. And I think a way that humanity has evolved to deal with that is exactly sort of meditation, in that you sort of or let's say though, the connectedness route of saying my way of dealing with the absurdism of the body I'm in is to say I'm one with everything. I'm not actually limited by anything. Yeah, there wasn't really a question there. It was more just that.
It's our resident philosopher on this side of the table, yes.
It's just that that is a way of dealing with it, I suppose. We do chat absurdism sometimes.
We love it. It's neuroscience, philosophy, they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Obviously my philosophy classes are more everybody's like, no, consciousness is just neurons firing. And I'm sitting there like, no, guys, open your mind.
Gotta be thinking more.
Very, very interesting discussions in that field.
I mean, I guess we can ask the final
I
question.
know, I
if
did
you
want to
have.
ask, so do you think that your philosophical background, and so your views, which I have to say I do agree with, influence your ethical and moral views on neurological interventions? Because like you said, we don't really know if that consciousness is occurring between neurons or across regions of the brain.
And this is a 30-second go.
Yeah. So I guess my background, I've actually got a degree in philosophy, which was maybe I should know more philosophy. What I would say, I think it more at least allows me to value the perspective of ethicists and actually really what they're doing and the importance of that and how we embed that, for example, in the work that we're doing at ARIA. So I don't know if it really guides how I go about doing the science that I do necessarily, but certainly the importance of these kind of variety of voices.
Okay.
No, I found the same. Like once you go from philosophy and then you try and do something more quantitative, it doesn't really guide how you do it, but it is something aware in some of the questions you ask.
Consideration.
Yeah,
Sure.
100%. Okay, all right. Well, I think that was 30 minutes bang on the dot. Thank you so much for being guests on our show. I mean, we're saying thank you now. We're going to walk with you to the talk and then hear you do a lovely presentation. But thank you, people on YouTube or Spotify, for listening. And we will catch you in the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Amazing.
Awesome.
All right, we'll wrap up there.
Cheers.